Let's start with a prayer. Lord, it's Christmas time, and it brings to us hopes for peace and love. Thank you for it, for it's changed history, changed the world. Thank you for each other, for the blessings of this fellowship and friendship we have here. Thank you for coffee hours and cookies and coffee and things like that, which draw us together. This morning, we're going to be studying about taking the best seat. We ask that we can take these things to heart and bless us as we study these parables. We pray this in the name of Jesus Christ, who is Lord and Savior. Amen. Okay, from starting with Luke 14, I'm going to read 1 through 13. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees, they were watching him. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy. And Jesus spoke to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they were silent. And then he took him and healed him and let him go. And he said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day?" And they could not reply to this. Now he told a parable to those who were invited. When he marked out, they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by anyone to a marriage feast, do not sit down in the place of honor, lest a more eminent man than you be invited by him. And he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give place to this man,' and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, go up higher.' And then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." And he said to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your kinsmen or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you feast, invite the poor, the maimed, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." Okay. A couple things about this. I have been pondering for quite some time now, trying to develop an elevator speech,
Oh, good luck.
so that I can phrase in the time you're in an elevator, maybe 15 minutes, on what the significance of what's the social glue that holds us together? What about the bonding part of it? And one of the things that I have discovered in talking about this is that eating is very, very significant part of social bonding. It goes back forever.
That's a good point.
And it's so we consider this.
You're right.
When you get a group of people together and you get there and you want to bond them as a people, as a group, get them to do things together.
That's true.
The first thing that they do when you go to boot camp is teach you to march. That's on purpose. That's not superfluous. They do that. They dress you the same, of course, but they teach you to march. What do you have? You have music and you have a beat and everybody's marching to it. And you get the same thing happening in a rock concert.
Mhm.
You get the music, the beat, people jump up and down and, and sometimes, yeah, da, 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 dum, dum.
Right.
Everybody will, that is a powerful clue. It's powerful. We do it in church. We stand up and sing. The singing part of our worship service is extraordinarily important in bonding us together for what's happening. We're breathing together. We're saying the same words on the same pitch. We're standing up and sitting down together. And this is the kind of thing that draws us together. And amongst all that, I mean, as part of that process of doing things together, one of it is eating. And it's ancient, literally ancient. When people come together, what's happening? You're eating, you're tasting the same thing, you're chewing, you have the same odors, and of course you're sitting around, and frequently all kinds of other stuff happens. And when you're eating, there's food and music, and frequently there's singing, we have spectator events, football. Oh Lord, I watched the Army Navy game yesterday. It was wonderful. I have to tell you, when they sang the Navy Blue and Gold at the end, brought tears to my eyes.
Oh, sure.
So, I mean, that's my stuff.
Yeah, yeah.
It's a place to talk. Jesus was real smart. And what did he leave us with? Communion. A meal together, shared together. Sometimes meals, and anytime you get together can be augmented by drugs or alcohol. Sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. Um, so, but this is part of what it means to be a human being and bonded together, and it's powerful. It can generate hostility. Anybody who's been to Thanksgiving dinner perhaps sometimes has experienced that. Any of you ever watched Beard? No, not the Beard, the Bear, which is
Yeah, I've heard it's really good.
yeah, it's really excellent. If you gotta watch Disney to see it. Anyway, we watched Bear last night. We've been watching it, and they had a dinner scene. It was the most awful dinner I have ever even heard of being portrayed. It was terrible. So it's partly because of this closeness and bonding, and if there are hostilities, they can break out in a major way. We see in the New Testament a lot of eating, a lot of dinners, a lot of festivals, a lot of marriage celebrations, all these things where people come together to eat. And it's common. I mean, we have cookies. Right, cookies and coffee, potlucks, lordy, God invented potlucks, right? I mean, right after Eve and Adam left the garden, I'm certain. And then there's, for a feast and a festival, there's the opportunity to rejoice, to get together, for a host to show himself, to show largesse. It's a place of safety ordinarily. It's where there are lots of weddings. It's birthdays, even there's a birthday in March 6/21. And invitations are regularly handed out in the New Testament. These things are ordinarily by invitation, and this one is too today. And finally, not only, well, I would also point out that dinners are a major, in those days, a major source of social engagement. The Greeks, the dialogues of Plato, a lot of them happened at dinner, over dinner. And they would come together for symposia, and the Greeks would come together and have discussions, all kinds of stuff. So this is no small thing that's happened here. And we're gonna run across it a lot more, in fact, because in a lot of the banquets and the marriage feasts in the Gospels are covered in more than one Gospel. So far, I've limited our studies to what appears in just one Gospel. It's gonna get more complicated when we go to 2 or 3. So, but at any rate, we're gonna find a lot more as we move forward. And in fact, what follows this, when we look at this setting, immediately following this is what we call an episode of a messianic banquet, which occurs twice, once in Matthew and once here in Luke. So that's part of the setup of this, is a marriage feast when the Messiah comes. At any rate, it's a major part of entertainment, of social gathering, celebration, and it's a major game. Now, for the setup of this, we see in verse 1 that one Sabbath he went to dine at the house of a ruler who belonged to the Pharisees. The word ruler there is archon. We see ARCH is a base word meaning primary, first. So that and it occurs 36 times and 8 times in Luke. And it means ruler, leader, member of, for instance, he's a leader of the Pharisees. So he's probably a member of the Sanhedrin. And the discussion is with the Pharisees, which is a typical discussion of the law. That's the setup here. After it, we find a messianic banquet in verses 22, 1 through 10. So what you have here is, in terms of setting of a dinner, celebration, etc., and then the particular setup where you have this dialogue with the Pharisees and then the messianic banquet afterwards. The ruler is one who is a ruler of the Pharisees. And I will point out that a man came to him, had the dropsy. The dropsy is hydropikos. The hydro is hydraulic, hydros. That's the root word, means water. It is a technical medical term for edema, swelling of the limbs, etc. And it's one of the reasons we call Luke the physician. Well, we've never named that, but one of the things that appears in Luke's writings frequently are medical terms such as this. It only appears here in the New Testament, nowhere else. So the guy has the dropsy. In the Synoptic Gospels, healing on the Sabbath occurs only in Luke. Matthew doesn't talk about healing on the Sabbath.
That is interesting.
And verse 5, he said to them, which of you, having a son or an ox has fallen into a well, will not immediately pull him out on the Sabbath day? Now, if you look at the footnote, there's a footnote A, I think that's what it is. Yeah. It's S here, and S says other ancient authorities read an ass. Now, there is the appearance of an ass in earlier. Luke 14, and Luke 13, 15, etc. It's an offensive term to say that you have the son and the ox are compared, right?
Yeah,
And
that's
so-
bad enough with the ox.
Yeah,
really.
yeah, bad enough with the ox, but in elsewhere you will find ox and an ass.
Mhm.
And this is a case where, in order to avoid offense, apparently some scribe, on a model of 4 in Luke, uh, didn't put in son, but put in, donkey or ass. So it reads ox and an ass rather than an ox or son.
Mm.
And this is a case where things kind of get massaged in order to make sure that people are not offended.
But it does make you wonder whether there was an intention of
Offense.
offense.
Yeah.
It's entirely possible.
Yeah.
And it's unlikely that they would have amended it the other way around,
Right,
that from donkey to son.
right.
So it would appear that Jesus intentionally said this.
Mhm.
So that, or at least it's clearly in the tradition that Luke is taking from. It's one of the general rules of textual interpretation is that very rarely will somebody amend a text to make it more offensive.
Mhm.
It's always the other way around.
Mhm.
So when you get something like this, you can pretty well guess that son was the original, and in fact, our strongest sources, most ancient sources have son instead of donkey or ass. The King James, the donkey or ass is in the King James version, and it generally is found in translations up until through the 19th century. So it was very strong tradition. Probably specifically following the King James. King James version, of course, had a major influence, but it's also in the Latin.
Mm.
So it's it's just one of those things that um, is strange here. Now, in what it says after the setup in verse 7, Jesus says, "Now he told a parable to those who were invited." Now, the word parable actually exists there, right? But if you look up the parables of Jesus, and there are frequently people who make lists of the parables of Jesus, this one is frequently not there.
Understandably.
Pardon me?
I said understandably.
Yeah, because it's not a story,
Yeah, right.
and it's not a metaphor.
Yeah.
But nonetheless, it's labeled a parable, so I included this one for the very interesting message, but specifically so that we would understand that the term parable is flexible.
So is it possible, Ed, that it sounds like it sounds like Luke is saying that the parable is exactly what follows the word. Now he told a parable,
Yes,
but there is a parable at verse 15 or something that really does come into play.
yeah, now that's verse
Right.
15, that's the.
So that's later,
That's the
right?
messianic banquet.
Right, so could that be the parable that Luke is referring to? No, okay, all right,
And
okay,
that's a distinct parable, and it is a story.
Yeah. Yeah.
So I don't believe.
okay, so he really is referring to this passage is
I
what
think
he's,
so, yeah.
what he's calling the parable, yeah.
So,
Yeah.
But at any rate, it is labeled a parable, but it is not the parable that we are used to, like the prodigal son or because it is really some more wisdom teaching in this.
I guess it's sort of a parable in the sense that he is not really talking about a marriage feast or where you seat yourself. he is really talking about your relationship to others and to God, and that, I mean, he's not really saying you'll,
The
you know,
next time you go down.
right, the next
Yeah.
time you go to a wedding, make sure you do this. That's really not what he's
talking
saying,
about, think of others first,
right?
basically.
Right.
in this.
What do you think it says? I mean, look at what we have here is, we have it in two phases. One is be careful of where you sit, and that's literally, in Proverbs, 25:6. Do not put yourself forward in the king's presence or stand in the place of the great. For it is better to be told, come up here, than to be put lawyer in the presence of the prince, which your eyes have seen. We saw, the use of last week when we saw the use of wisdom literature. We see it here as well. And, but this notion of the high and the low is fundamental to the message of the prophets. Isaiah 2:12, for the Lord of hosts has a day against all that is proud and lofty, against all that is lifted up and high. So, this notion of, um, um, being, taking priority over others. The prophetic messages regularly. The first shall be last and the last first, and that's what Jesus said. And we forget that. We forget that notion in our relationships and sometimes even in our own books. It's hard to sit back and be in the back pew sometimes. And then in verse 12, he also said to the man who invited him, when you have a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your kinsmen or your rich neighbors, lest they invite you in return and you be repaid. How about that? Consider this, Luke 6:32. For if you love those who love you, what credit is that to you? Even sinners love those who love them. And if you do good to those who do good to you, what credit is that to you? For sinners do the same, and if you lend to those from whom you hope to receive, what credit is that to you? Even sinners lend to sinners to receive as much again. And then finally we get down to verse 14. And this seems to, what we're seeing in the parables, that this is a continuing theme. And you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. You will be repaid in the resurrection of the just, or the resurrection of the righteous, or righteous and just are the same, basically. That's right out of Daniel, folks. It's a general resurrection when only the righteous are raised. So, okay. So, what do you think? How do you feel?
Well, first of all, the first 6 verses. Um. I don't see really how they relate to the parable at the table.
They don't, they're just
Okay.
a setup.
Okay, so this setup doesn't seem to be terribly relevant to this particular.
But it puts,
Parable.
all it does is put it in a context.
What's the context?
So what's,
A dinner,
oh,
They
okay.
were at a dinner.
A dinner.
and starts
Oh,
talking
you're
about-
at a dinner.
Oh, yeah, on a Sabbath, they had gone for a meal to the house of one of the leading
Okay.
Pharisees. And they
Okay.
watched him closely, so. Okay, so, but that has a different message here,
It
it does
does.
in fact have a message,
It
but
does.
it's not especially related, it's just. that-
well,
okay.
it's all related, but Luke, for some reason, put in the word parable to talk about seating
Okay,
and inviting. Say that's where it's, the use of the term parable here is a little unusual. So that's what, what goes before it is the setup to it, and then there's a message.
And the
Yes.
message is to the Pharisees.
No,
No,
Well, this message is, right?
well, I mean, if
the setup is about the Pharisees.
I know, but the context is we're at a dinner and he told a parable at the dinner, and
That's
at the dinner are the Pharisees.
Yeah, so
Well,
the,
but there are others too.
We don't
Well,
see that.
We don't see that, but.
How do we know that? There's other people.
well, there's lawyers. It says, and Jesus addressed the lawyers and Pharisees.
Okay, so they're all legalish people.
People, right?
Well,
So why did they invite him?
Yeah. Why did they invite
It
him?
seems, well, I guess I'm thinking they invited him to watch him and
Yeah.
test him, and he seems to at least twice kind of insult them. So one is, your son or an ass. And then he starts giving advice about where people should be seated at, it's like, where is he, I wonder, in this table?
Right,
At this dinner.
yeah, good
You
question,
know?
right?
So
Good
he's
question.
kind of like, well, you've invited me to this dinner, so I'm gonna let it all out here.
Right, it's true. But it does seem like. Ed, is your understanding that the people at this dinner, you think that there were more than Pharisees and lawyers?
The common thing for when people are invited, and when hosts invite, is to invite a whole, a broader group.
Even, even
Some-
then, even then.
Even then.
So the Pharisees would have invited lowly people?
Well, but maybe, yeah,
Because
because these folks
No.
were not
I don't
deaf
think so.
to the.
Okay, so, okay, interesting.
Because it says they watched him closely, and they watched him closely.
But not only that. Even in the group of Pharisees are gonna be higher and lower. I mean, there,
Mm,
where people sit in church, where, what happens at any group.
Yeah.
There are poobahs and there are lesser folks. And that's the dynamic he's talking about. However many different folks are represented in terms of status. There's in every group,
right, good point.
there's a
People of a
status.
higher status and
Right.
lower status. But, but is he talking, is he really talking about where you sit? That's the question, right? Since Luke calls this a parable, I think we have to say it's not about where you sit. But he sums it up for us in verse 11.
Yeah, yeah.
Right. Um,
Yeah, and what he sees as being important is being honored,
right,
getting honored.
right,
And the way you do that is by
not,
sitting in a lesser place.
right,
Not, right,
Yeah.
but the fact that then they'll all see how great you are is what this says.
right,
If you don't do this other thing, so take the best spot,
right.
but instead sit where
Then you'll get the honor,
then you'll get the honor.
which is not what we would think of as being what he would value.
Exactly.
And the next part is like that too, you get the honor of having other people be obligated to you.
To you, right?
And why would
So,
that be
yeah,
a
so
value?
what is the honor then?
Right,
Whose honor do we really want,
right.
and
Yeah.
how do we really get it?
I mean. But actually, maybe it's not talking about really honor of people, it's talking about, I mean, is this talking about? Don't exalt yourself, because ultimately, on Judgment Day, that self exaltation is not going to serve you well,
Mhm.
right?
So then
So,
Judgment
just,
Day is,
yeah, you need to humble yourself, and if you humble yourself, really, maybe we have to think of it in less sort of critical, but if you really do humble yourself, it means that you need the grace of God.
I think you're right.
You really, I mean, it's not talking about false humbling.
Good
It's not really saying, oh, just take that, just pretend like you're humble. I think he's really saying, really be humble.
Really, yeah, really.
Yeah.
good.
Yeah,
Shouldn't expect to be repaid.
yeah,
You should
right,
Just
right.
Yeah,
And if you,
if you expect that, if you have that expectation, that's wrong.
right,
Because you have the,
right,
you're, you have
Right.
to include the poor and the crippled, everybody,
right,
and they can't repay you.
right. And
And that should not be what you're after.
Right, you
You
should not.
be after repayment, you should,
And-
You're not doing this just to look good.
right,
yeah.
right.
Doing it
And
because-
you're all,
You're doing it
right.
Because you sincerely care about these
Right.
people.
That's
Right.
this message.
that's right. I think that's it. It's hard to see that in what's written because it
Mhm.
sounds like a payoff. Do this and you'll be paid.
It
It
does.
sounds that
Yeah.
way, right? But but we have to believe it's not that. What do you think, Ann?
I'm thinking it's like, well, we're thinking, God sees me doing all these good things. You see me, right, doing this good thing and doing that good, and I'm not asking any credit for it. You know,
But the question
how
is.
do I get beyond that to doing things like you said? For the good of the people,
Right.
and not because I know it's the right thing to do, or because I think God will be pleased if I do it. But just because it is the right thing to do is hard to me. It's
So
hard to not want that payoff.
I think, and
Bring
there's,
food. And so
go ahead.
bring food to the rotating shoulder.
Mhm.
Yeah.
But it seems like there's a distinction, I think I feel like there's a distinction between doing it because, because I want to have that place in heaven, let's say. Or I want that reward because I want that's, but wanting wanting to do what's right and wanting to please God doesn't feel like a bad thing to me. Wanting a reward feels different than wanting to please God.
Mhm.
Yeah, I can see that distinction too,
Mhm.
definitely.
Mhm.
In pleasing God, are we likely to please people?
We would think so.
Well,
Wow.
we're not gonna probably please the poobahs, as you call them. But we might make some hungry person feel better, and that would be great. Right? So we're gonna please, we hope, if you're doing the right thing for the right reason, that it makes another human feel better. Because that's what we're doing here, but because that's the right thing.
So if he's talking to the poobahs, as we like to call them. Right, if he's saying, if he told this parable to make a point to them. He may be also sort of playing into their psychology, which is they do want to be exalted. And so, and really
Oh, yeah.
right, and so he's sort of tailoring this parable for them,
For the
okay.
Pharisees,
Here's
right, cause that's the setting.
Right,
There
that
he
is the setting
and the lawyers.
Yeah, lawyers and the Pharisees.
You know, so he is sort of speaking to that, that understanding of life. Like,
Mhm.
I want to be,
They set the example, we follow their example.
yeah. But then in so doing, by saying, you know, so if they then follow his advice, something good may come of it by, they may be doing it for the wrong
I was
reason,
gonna say, and that's the only reason I'm doing it.
Right.
I'm waiting for that call to go up the table.
Right,
I'm
right.
expecting that, yeah, Jesus said that's what's gonna happen if I
Right.
go sit down there.
Right,
Mhm, mhm.
right, but if they expand it past the table and then in other element, I don't know.
I had some experiences. As a state clerk and as a, possible politician, I once ran for city council in Ann Arbor. And I didn't get much support from, I ran as a Republican. But I ran a forceful campaign. And and my experience is that all of a sudden, people started to include me in this campaign. And I got invited to dinners and to golf matches and golf tournaments and stuff like this. And people would consult with me. Lost the election and they went away. Which.
But
I
you
guess-
might have been a powerful person.
Yeah, I might have been, and I consider myself a retired politician now, so. I also stood for election as stated clerk of the General Assembly.
Mm.
I was the stated clerk here in the Presbyterian Detroit. And, that's a slightly different story, but when I ran for stated clerk, I remember, once again, I ran hard. I lost there too, but, one of the things that was extraordinary, I had the same experience where people in the church, the people in the know, the important people wanted to consult with me and wanted to talk to me and wanted to know my opinion about lots of stuff.
Isn't that interesting, right?
And
People are drawn to power.
it's very, it's a heady experience.
Yeah.
It really is. I didn't know how to do that. One of. The term, the word stated clerk is kind of obscure. But it's basically the chief ecclesiastical officer of a higher council in the Presbyterian. You know, you have a clerk of session, anything above clerk of session is called stated clerk. Clerks of session are elected annually, or for usually annually. Clerks of presbyteries and synods and general assembly are elected for a term, whereas the moderator, who's the one who presides over the meeting, is elected annually. To a verse in a church, moderator, which is the pastor, is elected permanently, and the clerk is, anyway. So, as the stated clerk of Presbyterian, I was the senior ecclesial officers with the term is. And I know some clerks played that a lot. That's not the way I like to play it. I prefer just to be in the background. And I had technically the only duties of a clerk of Presbytery is to take the minutes and keep the rules of Presbytery. That's what the Book of Order says. But, you know, there came a lot more power with it. Not just because I was this ecclesial officer, permanent ecclesial officer. I have become 30 years. Anyway, I found as a practical matter, I didn't get much glory. I don't think they liked me much, but I had more power than I ever wanted. Really.
By taking minutes, you could, and what
Well,
else?
first of all, just to give you an idea, the extraordinary power of being a record keeper is enormous.
Because you've got the pen.
Well, I've got the pen. And the record of the proceedings is extremely important. Second, I knew the rules.
Yeah,
My responsibility, among other things, was, it's not in the Book of Order, but it's practically there, is to be parliamentarian. And the interesting thing about that in Detroit, they have there's a chapter of the National Association of Parliamentarians that operates out of this church Farmington, like a Birmingham. So they have all these parliamentarians who loved parliamentary procedure. I never went to one of those meetings, but I was a practical parliamentarian, and I knew parliamentary procedure, know it better than most parliamentarians. So I'm real good at it. And so I knew the rules. I also knew the Book of Order better than anybody. So if somebody needed an interpretation, they came to me. And just that power alone to interpret the law is extraordinary. And I can tell you that I needed to be very careful. Because it can go to your head, man. It can really.
So I have one more thing. We never, I mean, I've been focusing on 7 through 11,
Yeah.
but if you go 12 through 14, it's the
More
same,
dinner.
essentially the same message, but this is what's hitting me. This is going to be really obvious. But I'm realizing Jesus spends a lot of time telling people, it seems like, that if you are rewarded in this life, you will not be later,
It does seem, yeah, a lot of the parables.
right? And if you are not rewarded in this life, you will be. So, so what you should sort of, it's not, so maybe you should seek a path that doesn't include reward in this life,
Mhm. The meek shall inherit the earth.
right?
Yeah.
I mean,
Is
like,
that- is
do
that
not,
the-
I mean, just like, or if you wanna have your reward now, fine, but just realize that's it. You're done, right? If you're, it seems like that's, yeah,
Seems like that.
what do you think? Yeah.
For those of us living a good life, it's a pretty scary thought.
I mean, he's not saying that if you get your reward in this life, you're gonna be punished. It's not that, it's just that, it's like, I don't know what it is. What is it? What is he?
Well, that makes me think about, the vineyard keeper. We said, you know what, I can't do what I want with my own things,
Right,
you know?
right. And the answer is, yep, you can't, or you shouldn't,
God can.
right? Yeah.
Ah, that's interesting.
There just seems to me there's an underlying revolutionary element of Jesus' teaching. And that is that it's contrary, success, or in God's eyes, in Jesus' eyes, in his message, this notion of the last first and the first last is far more pervasive and powerful
Mm-hmm,
than we'd like to give it.
mm-hmm,
And it's a fundamental part of the message that about life.
mm-hmm. And let's think about this again, also in terms of the sermon, no, not the sermon. Yeah, a little bit in the sermon today. And it happens pretty frequently in our church where someone is saying, oh, you all are so good. You're doing a great job. Look at what we're doing as a church. We do this, we do that. Wow. Why? And I always hate that so much, frankly. It feels like, ugh, don't do that. But I think you do, you have to do that in the pulpit to make sure people come back, or what, that they pledge? I don't know, but I don't know. That's not in keeping. That's not in keeping with what I'm reading, is it? What do you think?
I have to get back to what Ed was talking about. When you were going through all those jobs in the Presbyterian and so on. how did you feel about that? Or did you feel conflicted all the time or worried about it or?
Yeah. And it's even worse because sometimes being a good clerk doesn't mean you're a good Christian. I, I, I had to. I had duties as a clerk. Duty, and these are obligations to the Presbyterian. And sometimes those obligations meant that I did things that I didn't really like. Particularly disciplinary stuff. I mean, I can remember having to go to a pastor and get his keys from the church and say, you can't be here anymore.
Why was it you? Was that part of the clerk's job?
So that's part of the duties that was assigned me, particularly and under the rules of discipline. I had a major role in the rules of discipline.
Is that standard for stated clerks?
Yes,
They all have to,
the
Because they
beyond,
know the rules.
beyond taking
Yeah.
the minutes and
okay,
and keeping the record, the rules. There
okay,
are other specific book of order duties, and that's under the rules of discipline.
got it,
And so when discipline happens, sometimes it's not pretty,
yeah.
and it's not forgiving at all. And I did it to protect the presbytery.
Oh, how is that protecting the Presbyterian? Because,
I once had I was called one day, and had a, somebody call me, or actually it was the Presbyterian exec, and say, we got somebody who's, in, a youth leader at one of our churches. They've found, that he has been convicted of an offensive, sexual offense against youth.
Mhm,
What should we do?
mhm.
He's very good. And he appears to be reformed. And my response was the lawyer's response, so we can't have him. We just can't, it's too much of a threat to the presbytery,
Oh,
so.
not to the kids? Also, to
Well,
the-
they would
I
See,
mean,
that's it. If something should happen to the kids,
then it would be,
then see, it's our
Reflected on the
responsibility is to protect the kids. And if we don't, we're in deep yogurt.
Yeah.
So sometimes, because of my duties to protect the Presbyterian, I was very good at that.
Mhm,
Being a lawyer, very helpful.
mhm.
I, I found myself having to do things that I think were contrary to the spirit of the gospel.
Mhm.
Now, you guys work, you have families, you're in various organizations, church, stuff like that. That kind of situation comes up all the time, doesn't it?
Yeah.
To where you have a duty. Here's one of the things that I have found. You are more willing to sacrifice people who love you because they'll forgive you.
Mhm.
And you're less willing to give offense to people who won't forgive you.
Yeah.
I can tell you, churches are not very forgiving sometimes.
Mm.
And the real cost of that is to the pastor's family.
Oh, interesting.
It's a common dynamic. We
Tell
don't
it-
talk about it much,
Yeah,
but it's true.
How, in what regard?
Because, you know, I used to go out to committee meetings 3 nights a week.
That's a lot to be
So-
going to.
There would frequently be 3 nights a week, and sometimes less, sometimes not, but, and that has no cost to my family. Um, and I do it, I did it. Not because I didn't love my family, but because they loved me, and I figured they would forgive. If, on the other hand, I didn't go to this meeting, the church might not be so forgiving, say.
Right. Yeah, that is a conflict always, job versus family, you know, obligations versus other obligations.
Were people who took those jobs aware of all the ins and outs of it, what to expect for what might happen in a case study? So you go into that with your
What
eyes
people who
open,
took
or,
which jobs are we talking about?
I'm sorry,
Which jobs are we talking about?
I'm talking the one about where you had to decide whether to do something that you did with the children. Whether, if you're in a position of power at the church, do you know going into that job that you're gonna have these problems coming at you?
Oh,
Or it's possible that
I
you,
think, I had no clue about that when I became state clerk. Some people, I'm persuaded, take jobs like that for the power.
Hmm.
And I found that power to be not pleasant,
very dangerous, yeah.
but it's power and prestige are things that drive us, aren't they? I mean, it felt good, you know, to stand up before the Presbyterian and say, okay, folks, here are the rules. Because I knew what the rules are, and I was very good at keeping the rules. And you don't usually get the impact of that in a local congregation, but this church did with Fairfax. I enforced the rules to the letter. And that's what saved my buns. And, it also, I think, saved First Presbyterian Church. But it wasn't pleasant, really, really unpleasant. And I know there are people who don't like me because I do, but.
There's some people who really like you because you did it. Right.
No, but I'm, yeah, you can't, it's a no-win situation. But it's part of what made things very uncomfortable. And it's this notion of, I think, what I'm trying to talk about is this notion of sitting in the seat of power. Sitting next to the host,
Oh, yeah.
sitting, or inviting people who are powerful. That's heady stuff, man.
Yeah.
That's really heady stuff.
So then, does that go along with the idea of the cost of discipleship?
Yes, I think. Uh, There are not many leaders that we call humble. There are some. George Washington's humility was powerful when he was president. But he was also a very proud man, so. But his willingness to subordinate his own interests and predilections for the sake of his belief in this country. Somebody like Saint Francis, who gave up wealth, power to serve the poor and become a beggar. You know, that happens somebody, and folks like that are really, really powerful. But then the other side of that are the Savernoles, the people who, in church history, who came to great power. And Lord and known people along.
Our daughter-in-law in Switzerland went to seminary to become a minister. And when she got to the point where she was being questioned at the end of it all, after she'd done all the classes and everything, the Church of Scotland turned her down because they didn't like what she had to say about the sacraments.
Mm.
And she tried to fight them off, and it didn't make a bit of difference. She was fighting the Church of Scotland. And they let her do some things, but there are certain words in the communion that she cannot say. A minister has to say those words. I don't know if that's like.
And what's happening there is that the church is protecting itself. Say, the church is protecting what it considers to be important.
It's so interesting because the church is supposed to be about its people.
Well, that's correct. But every people. So it gets tough. That's, no,
I have heard of a close to home situation where the tabs that ministers are supposed to wear. If a person who wants to be a minister refuses to do it, can that stop the ordination?
not in the
Will not?
Presbyterian church, but in some churches perhaps, yes.
Okay, so that's not as tough a deal.
It's, see, each church sets its own standards. And that's, the church you join is glued together by a history, by a set of premises and order and theology and stuff like that. It's messy is what it really is. And each church wants to protect that. What will happen is that if a person won't meet particular standards, then the churches will tend to reject them. Now, some churches are more strict about that than others. Presbyterian Church is intentionally very
Inclusive.
graceful about that. However, it's not entirely true. We've had in my period, I've been part of Presbyterian Church as a pastor since 1976. I have encountered twice in between 76 and when I retired in 2020, a general exodus of churches because we were not pure enough. And so people believed that they are unable to be a part of this church because of certain things the church believed or did. And so they left.
Which makes sense, because as you have said, that's how you choose a church.
Yeah.
You choose a church based on,
And so what they're doing is rejecting something for the sake of their own vision.
well, or they find another church that is more in keeping with
Yes.
their vision, right?
See, this is complicated stuff because we're always. Okay. This goes back to the glue. What each church, each family, each organization of any kind has bonding principles and ideas, and will fight to keep that glue in place to preserve the group.
You're right.
So
Yeah.
families are the same way. That's the notion that we are social people from the very beginning. And so we are frequently willing to take all kinds of unchristian steps just to preserve what we have. And that's the great paradox of Christianity. We live in a world that is sinful, But we want to,
So I think it's also, there is, it is true, there's probably a choice to be made between following the church, I mean, being a committed follower of the church and following Jesus. Those are two not identical statements, right?
turns out that what we're gonna read next week is really addressing this and it's significant. We're gonna read the parable of the weeds and wheat. In Matthew,
The weeds and the wheat.
Matthew 13:24-30. And that's one of the most significant, for church purposes, it's one of the most significant of all the parables.
Matthew what? It's Matthew.
Matthew 13:24-30.
Okay.
It's also found in the Gospel of Thomas, number 57. For those of you who saved it, you can go in the Gospel of Thomas and you go to paragraph 57, and we'll see a similar parable there. Jesus said, in a very short piece, and we'll talk about that.
I have another question.
Yes.
Is one of the issues for people in power, they don't want to explain themselves to other people, that they don't feel that the congregation isn't gonna understand them or agree with them when they hear what the rule is. So that's gonna be the problem. So we don't know what's going on most of the time,
That's well, I think.
unless it's obvious.
Yeah. Yeah, when you get power, it's hard to hold on to it.
Would you say that again?
When you get power, if power is what you want, it's hard to hold on to it. And lots of things threaten it. And stuff happens that threatens your power. And if stuff happens that threatens your power, your immediate response is frequently to restrict information about stuff that threatens your power. And that's just ordinary human nature. We protect ourselves. We don't tell everybody everything. We don't tell our children or our spouses everything. We don't tell the church everything. Because we want to protect our status and ourselves. Everything churches and everything would be just fine if we just didn't have all these people to deal with. It's because none of us is perfect and we all, it's hard to give that up, I think. So,
That job is tougher than we ever realized.
it's tough. The world being a Christian is not easy. And if it is easy, it's probably because you're lying to yourself. I think it's personally very difficult. Okay, thank you. Next, we meet next week, but we will not meet the 2 following weeks, the week after Christmas and the week after New Year's. So we won't, so we do meet next week. Thank you, folks.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah.